Welcome, Duke alumni and friends, to this session of the Duke Alumni Forever Learning Institute, an interdisciplinary educational program organized in a set of thematic courses. My name is Katie Douglas. I am from the class of 2011, and I serve as Associate Director of Administration and Program Development in the Duke Office of Climate and Sustainability. Thank you so much for joining today's program titled A Tale of Many Energies. This program is part of our theme on energy transformation, where we will be examining the current state of energy, energy cleanup, access to energy, and emerging technologies. Today's program is the first session in this series that will explain the current state of energy. While many STEM fields are capitalizing on a more diverse range of professionals, the energy sector trails behind other fields, though it is improving. As you participate in this session and other sessions in this series, you'll hear from some terrific Duke faculty members and alumni from across the Duke community, but fewer women and non-binary voices than we would like. Acknowledging that there's a problem is the first step toward addressing the issue, and recognizing the gender disparity in the energy sector is an important step toward creating a more dynamic and representative workforce. Joining us today is our host and moderator is Casey Goldstein, a current Duke undergraduate student from the class of 2024. Casey is an undergrad Duke student studying computer science and environmental science. During his time at Duke, Casey has been a member of the Duke Energy and Climate Club and was selected for the Green Devils program, helping bridge students and administration to achieve Duke's sustainability goals. After studying abroad, Casey co-founded College to Climate, a global platform dedicated to helping college students find careers in the climate space. Welcome to the Forever Learning Institute, Casey.
Thank you, Katie, and hi, everybody. I am so grateful to be here today with all of you. We have three amazing professors here to kick off this series, all of whom I've taken a class with at some point this past 4 years, so this feels very full circle for me. So without further ado, joining me today in conversation, we have Tom Cinq-Mars. Tom got his Ph.D. from Duke in 2020. He's currently the Assistant Director for Research Development at the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability. We have Nico Hotz. He's the Associate Professor of the Practice of Mechanical Engineering and Materials Science at the Pratt School of Engineering. And finally, last but not least, we have Tim Johnson, the Senior Associate Dean for Academics and Professor of the Practice of Energy and Environment at the Nicholas School of Environment. So just to kick us off, and I'll go from Tom and then Tim and then Nico, but Tom, if you just want to start by telling us a little bit more about yourself and your work here at Duke or beyond Duke.
Casey, thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here. It's wonderful to see all of you. Thanks again for joining the Forever Learning Institute. And Casey, you're going to have to remind me, is this where I can give my little presentation now, or are we going to wait just a little bit?
I'll default to Ann, but show any slides, just a quick introduction to who Tom is and what you're working on.
Got it. All right. Well, we can, but basically, again, I'm the Assistant Director for Research Development here at the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability. I'm an academic historian by training, and I like to study questions of energy transition. And in particular, my research focuses on the Russian oil industry and the long development of the Russian oil industry over the past 2 centuries or more. All right. And I do have a few quick slides that I can show you some of the questions that I'm interested in. Some of the bigger questions I can just show very quickly are, so this is sort of the big story from the history point of what energy transitions look like. So as you can see, for most of the past 2 millennia, there was not a whole lot going on and not a lot of energy being used. And then all of a sudden in the, right around the time that we tend to call the Industrial Revolution, there was a big explosion. And I think we'll go into a little more detail on that later in the talk. But so this sort of big story is what we're looking at. And for those of you who say, well, as you can see in the graph, we're looking at global GDP over time, and some of you are obviously very well-trained and skeptical former Duke student, and you might say, Tom, well, GDP is sort of a construct of economics. How can we possibly project that back in the past? And well, I can show you this graph here, which is population over time, and you'll see it's almost the same curve. All right. But, so questions of why things have happened this way on the large scale are very interesting to me. And once we get down on the national scale, things tend to get more interesting. But I'll hand it back over to Casey. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I love the visuals.
Yes.
Let's head over to Tim. Same question, if you just don't mind telling us a little bit more about yourself and your work here at Duke.
Yeah, well, thank you, Casey. Good to see you. So I'm an academic mutt in that I have a background that spans both engineering and public policy over many years. I worked after finishing my Ph.D. for the EPA, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, for about a decade. Wanted to get back in the classroom, started teaching here when the Nicholas School of the Environment launched its Graduate Energy Environment program, which I also chair. So in general, I'm interested in topics related to energy system planning, topics that require certainly an understanding of the science, the technology, really the engineering nuts and bolts, but that are so big that you can't ignore the policy, the economics, the historical dimensions. That's in a nutshell, that really is energy. So again, energy system planning. So not looking at the individual components, but how they come together in a system. I've done a lot of work with carbon capture, sequestration, a lot of work with biofuels. Somewhat different. I've spent time looking at urban design, urban planning, how that drives energy, pardon the pun, but how it drives energy use, particularly for transportation. And then do a lot of work with energy planning in the built environment. So I've interacted a lot with facilities management on campus as well. So kind of a broad portfolio of topics, all of which relate one way or another to design and planning and operating the energy system.
Perfect, Tim. Nico, last but not least.
Hi, thanks. My name is Nico Hotz. I'm faculty in the Department of Mechanical Engineering and Material Science in the Pratt School of Engineering here at Duke. I've been here for 14 years almost. I'm as well, since a few years, the Director of Undergrad Studies in Mechanical Engineering. So I spent most of my time in some ways working with undergrads, which is great. They are the best. I do research and I teach in energy, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't be here today. Mostly in renewable and sustainable energy. My education background is mechanical engineering. I'm a mechanical engineer, but I have a lot of connections in my background, in my training, and in my work today to chemical engineering and material science. So I'm in the right department. The engineering, applied material science connection works for me very well. And in that area, I have been working mostly on alternative fuels like hydrogen, some electrochemical systems, a bit batteries, but mostly fuel cells. As well as a lot of heat transfer, reducing heat losses is my area as well, especially in the context of solar thermal. I like to use sunlight to heat things to then run chemical reactions. I am professor of the practice, associate professor of the practice, and as such, I teach a lot of classes. They are all in energy or energy-related things. And especially I lead a focus program. That's a program for freshmen in the first semester, where we give them very deep dive into energy topics in just one semester without much math and physics and material science and whatever background. And in that program, I teach a class on the future of energy, where we try to show students or explore technologies and materials that may be promising for the future. I like to joke in my class, I can't predict the future, otherwise I would be probably super rich and may not be in my office right now. But we try to do our best to show students what they can do it. Casey was one of our students a few years ago in that program in that class.
Well, we will do our best today to try to make some predictions for the future, but nobody's gonna grade us there. Well, fantastic. What I love about this crew is that as we try to understand the history of energy, the present state of energy, and the future, you enable us to do it on 3 different levels. So we've got Tom, that's got the general high-level patterns of energy throughout history. Tim, maybe you can help us out with the policy and the economic side. And then Nico at the lowest level, the nitty-gritty, just understanding the technologies that have enabled energy and that can continue to enable energy. So in keeping with that thread, I want to go back to you, Tom, and just asking, in your specific discipline, what energy transitions have we seen from early human civilizations all the way to, let's say, the Industrial Revolution?
That's a great question, Casey. Thanks so much. So the short answer to your question is all of them. In the history of energy class that Nico was just mentioning, part of that focus cluster, in which or of which I should say Casey is a veteran. We started with fire, right? Or we still start with the domestication of fire, or the descent of Homo ignis, that is human beings, or human beings made human by the use of fire. And we move all the way through the agricultural revolution of the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, and the industrial revolution and the scientific revolutions of the subsequent centuries, and all the way into the atomic age. And right now, where we are in sort of the age of data and in the age of information. When we break it down, as you can see, by energy source, the story gets a little more complicated. And when we have data really going back 200 or so years, which might sound like a long time, of course, in human lifetimes, but in the great span of history, it's not very much at all, right? But what we see when we start to look at the individual pieces of this puzzle, right, is a multiplicity of energy transitions, and they look different depending on national contexts, right? So in the 1960s and 70s, there was a discovery of natural gas in the North Sea in Europe. And both England and the Netherlands made use of this new resource, but they had to do it in different ways because of different historical contexts. So the Netherlands was fortunate enough to make this transition really quickly. They were a smaller country, smaller population. They didn't have the barriers that England later had, where that they could easily phase out their use of oil and rapidly expand their use of natural gas. But right across the English Channel, the story was a lot longer. And you can see here with the use of natural gas in purple that transition was a lot more drawn out. So these are sorts of the things that we cover, right, in the historical discipline. Is we understand the big story, right, that E curve of history, but that we also need to look at sort of national contexts and smaller scales, and the story gets a lot messier, right, and also a lot more interesting.
I think it's so important to mention that this looked different for every single country over the course of history. Tim, same question for you. So early human civilization, how do we get from point A to maybe, past, 150 years ago, started the Industrial Revolution?
Yeah, maybe to layer something onto what Tom said, early energy use was human power, animal power, using fire for heat, some water power, wind power as well. Not a lot of variety, but we use those things directly. What happened with the Industrial Revolution is we learned how to turn energy into other things that were useful to us. So we figured out how to burn fossil fuels like coal, turn it into steam, and use that steam to run, a steam engine, something mechanical that gave us a great deal of power and allowed us to industrialize. Not all that long afterwards, we learned how to turn fossil fuels into electricity. So instead of using the fossil fuels directly to heat ourselves or to cook, we now could turn it into something that could run other devices. Likewise, with petroleum, we've learned how to use petroleum, which has been around. Well, petroleum has been around for millions of years, but we learned, we've used petroleum for a couple thousand years for things like waterproofing and mummification and whatnot. But we finally figured out how to turn it into an energy resource like gasoline, kerosene before that can provide another service. It could be run using a mechanical contraption, an engine, to give us mobility. So a lot of what we've seen in the last couple hundred years is taking what we call primary energy resources and turning them into other things that are even more useful to us and that we can leverage for even more power. And so, again, like I said, a lot of the transition, which, as Tom pointed out, has been uneven globally, has been, making greater use of the things that energy can provide for us and for a wider range of energy services. And we can talk a little bit more about where we are and where we are, going forward. I will just mention that, over the last, maybe 130 years or so, the development of the electric power industry, the utility industry, has moved along. Certainly it doesn't look identical to what it looked like in the late 1880s, But in many ways, that progress has been very incremental. And we're at a point now where we talk about this energy transformation, energy transition, but really it's significant transformation that will involve a lot more electrification. And we're at on the cusp of a great deal of change there as well. So again, Tom was talking really in many ways about kind of primary energy resources, thinking about how those are used. And now that is starting to, the change there is accelerating quite a bit.
Thank you, Tim. Nico, any thoughts to add there?
Well, I think a lot of what I would add as a mechanics engineer was already said by Tom and Tim. So I would have said the main two transitions that happened from a very, very early history to the Industrial Revolution was first, as already said, moving from human muscle, human power to animal power, which is much more powerful, much more effective, much more efficient in many ways to drive machines, to run transportation, transport humans, goods, entire vehicles, and to power machines for agriculture, for pumping water, and so on. And then the second transition from human to animal, then from animal further was, as was already said, to going to fuels, and they were mostly fossil fuels. Much more efficient. It required us as engineers to make much more complex machines, but they are much more powerful, they're much more efficient, and overall, in the long run, cheaper to run steam engines and other things than having horses or donkeys or whatever. I think I would add one more additional small piece, and I'll mention that probably later in different scenarios again here. Storage is as well very important. We talk a lot about energy generation, power generation, but energy storage is just as important. I think it will be even more important in the future when we go to more renewable and sustainable energy sources. And I think we have seen that in history as well a little bit. You need to feed humans, your human workers and your animal all the time versus a pile of coal or a barrel of oil you can store very long and use it whenever you want to. So I think we shouldn't forget about the aspect of energy storage. And that has changed from early human history to the Industrial Revolution as well.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, because certainly in what I've learned and as we look towards the future, that conversation will become more and more apparent, especially in the conversation of how do we store electricity as opposed to other forms that we've seen in the past. So thank you, Tom, for starting us from fire, and then Tim and Nico for bringing up our transition from from humans to animals to machines. We've got this backdrop of the history, and we've already started to allude to this, but we certainly haven't seen as much growth from maybe the 1850s to now as we saw from the dawn of human civilization. But surely there have been incremental changes. So I do want to just hone in on that little piece of history, the past 150 years or so. Maybe I'll start back at Nico and we'll work our way backwards. But what do you think are the most important things in your discipline that you've seen that has changed over the past 150 years or so?
Yeah, we have talked already, and I'm sure Tim will talk more about the different energy sources, primary energy sources. So I will not focus on those now, but they are, of course, very important. They changed a lot and are changing, will continue to change. But I want to focus on one aspect which I think is important. That's the kind of processes, the kind of technologies that we use for energy conversion and energy storage. And that is, we used since the Industrial Revolution and earlier on, of course, in less technological ways, combustion. A lot of our machines ran in the past and still do today on combustion. And combustion means you burn a fuel, often, of course, a fossil fuel, could be as well a renewable fuel. And combustion is not a very good process in many ways. It's very lossy. If you like the terminologies of thermodynamics, it's very entropy heavy. You generate a lot of entropy. It's high temperature. You have high energy losses through heat. And the high temperatures in things like gases, like air, for example, create a lot of pollutants, a lot of toxic and climate-changing gases. So combustion is not great. Again, a typical car engine has an efficiency of maybe 20% at best. 80% of the energy you're losing. You're not using it in any way. So what has been happening a lot, in my opinion, is moving away from combustion. We have gone more to photovoltaics over the last 10 years or so. We are using, in the US and worldwide, way more solar energy than ever before. It's still at a very low level, but it has been increasing exponentially. We are using other non-combustion things like nuclear energy. That has been coming up for decades, of course. think there's some potential that they may increase further in the future. And as well, electrochemical systems. We talk a lot about electric cars today, of course. They are non-combustion based technology. So I think one transition that has been occurring in the last decades in different technologies at different speeds in different ways, from combustion to anything other than combustion.
Great. Tim?
Yeah, I really can't stress how important, what Nico just said it is. We learned a while ago, a couple of 100 years ago, how to take fossil fuel, which is very, very energy dense, burn it, and then turn that heat into mechanical power. That is, in a nutshell, is the Industrial Revolution. We wouldn't be where we are today, quality of life, without that. We couldn't have jumped right to photovoltaics, for instance. But burning stuff is turning heat into mechanical power is a very inefficient way of using energy, whether it's for electric power production or for vehicles. And so now, what you are seeing is, driven largely by concerns with climate, the need to move beyond that. And I know we'll talk a little bit about future, here in just a moment. But, the last couple 100 years have been a time of significant change, certainly changes in scale. The scale of the power grid is, phenomenal. It's often referred to as the world's largest machine, and one that, despite the occasional outage, is really incredibly reliable. The more you learn about it, the more you marvel at, what a miracle it is that it functions as reliably as it does. And, it's a lot of it's, what we've done in the last century or so is just improve the technologies we have. Say what you will about it, gasoline-powered automobile engine, but it's an incredibly reliable device. We do need to move beyond burning stuff for energy, but we're like I said, that we've seen shifts in scale and just changes in efficiency and just the reliability of the devices we have. So what we're really seeing now again is changes in all of that.
Gotcha. Tom, how about you?
So I think I have more sympathy now for Nico having gone last at the end of the last 3 rounds. So I think I would just sort of reiterate a lot of the things Tim and Nico have said. For me, in particular, the question of nuclear power and nuclear power at utility scale, as Tim was alluding to, is really important. And this echoes Nico's point about combustion and problems with it, especially at large scales. As Tim mentioned, at small scales, combustion can be really useful, but at large scales, especially with concerns and mounting anxieties over climate change, we need to really rethink sort of what we're doing with our utility scale electricity generation. And at the moment, hydropower and nuclear power, and by nuclear power, we mean energy created by nuclear fission, which is the splitting of atoms. We might be hearing a lot in the news about nuclear fusion, which is the bringing of atoms together as a potential source. But I think many of us probably see that is very much in the future. But again, I have another sort of visual aid here, and you can see that the nuclear transition has been pretty. It's been steady initially in its beginning years, but it has been uneven for lots of different reasons: political, social, and environmental. Especially, you can see the dip in the graph in around 2011 with the Fukushima disaster in Japan. So I think there's a lot of questions surrounding nuclear power, but I think that this is really one transition that we need to focus on.
Thank you, Tom, and I'll make sure that we go back, reverse to get you to starting. But well, I'm just looking at the time. I'd love to talk a little bit about the future and maybe try to make some of those predictions. Sorry, Nico, but I do want to challenge you all to just talk about what sort of future energy policies, technologies, or general patterns we should be watching out for. You talked a lot about how we've seen in the past 150 years moving beyond burning and diversifying our sources of energy production away from biomass. So Tom, starting with you, glass ball moving into the future, what would you see as the biggest patterns that we'll see?
So I'll try to ignore the irony of asking a historian to predict the future, right? We're sort of allergic to that kind of thing. But I would say I think that one of the reasons we study the past is of course to learn from it, right, and to see what can we take from it that will help inform the decisions that we need to make going forward. And I have some things that I would share with you. And I guess they're more words of caution. History is full of irony, and in these bigger patterns and even these smaller patterns, we've seen that energy transitions can be really messy. And we've been able to deduce some sort of common causes for all the messiness. And we can go into some of these details maybe in the chat, but there are some phenomena that have, I wouldn't say slowed or encumbered, but have certainly made energy transitions a little more complex. So one of them would be this phenomenon of rebound effects, which is this weird phenomenon when the usage of energy-saving devices, such as cars with more gas mileage, for example, actually encourages people to use more energy in the aggregate. So if you have a car that, if you buy a car that all of a sudden has a lot more gas mileage, you might be incentivized to drive more and thereby use more gasoline, right? And this is a phenomenon that was identified way back in the 19th century, even in coal economies. And it's something that scholars still debate pretty vigorously, like to the extent that we really need to watch out for this kind of thing. But we generally agree that it does happen. The question is sort of at what scales and does this matter? Another one is, and it's even more sort of ethereal and harder to grab onto. It's this idea of a last gasp effect, where the creation and the implementation of new technologies actually drives a great deal of creativity in the use of old technologies. So we find, for example, that horses became really popular modes of transportation after the use of steam engines had exploded in parts of the so-called Western world, right, in Europe and in the United States. The idea that charcoal burning rather in the iron ore industry and the iron smelting industry in England had a moment of increasing popularity even after the adoption of coal. And part of that was political reasons and new taxes on coal. But they made ironmongers made charcoal a lot more efficient by building up bigger and bigger and bigger furnaces, these so-called monster furnaces. And the last one is this phenomenon, which we're probably a little more familiar with, is hybridization of technology, right? So we have electric hybrid cars, or cars that are gasoline and electric. They're not the first hybrids. In the 19th century, we had locomotives that were originally made for coal firing, but were converted to oil. And the great thing about hybrids is that they can surely save energy, but they can also lead, they're not, they can also allow for backsliding, right? So a hybridized locomotive that is made to run on oil can just as easily be transitioned to run exclusively on coal again. And this gets into a little bit of my research, but that would be the only thing that I would sort of encourage for looking at the future, is watching out for these patterns that we've seen in history, that history is full of irony, right? And the future will be as well.
That's going to be my big one takeaway. Hybrid vehicles have been around for quite some time. Yeah, Tim, Nico, I want to pass the same question about the future to you, if you just want to spend a minute or so, just so we have time for the breakout rooms. But any thoughts moving into the future?
Well, one thing I want to mention quickly is that, you go back to the early part of last century, early 1900s, the first decade, electric vehicles, battery-operated vehicles, actually outnumbered gasoline-powered vehicles. And there were also steam-powered vehicles at the time as well. And, you could have, if you were around at that time, I wasn't, you wouldn't have been wrong to think that maybe the future of transportation was electric. There were a number of reasons having to do with misjudging markets and things like that, as well as some technology development that, led us down the gasoline path. But what I wanted to say, I agree with Tom about predicting the future being somewhat difficult. But rather than saying, here's what will happen, I think the better way to approach that question is to say, if we have a goal, if we want to reduce carbon emissions, what would have to happen to reach that goal? And there are a lot of pathways that would get us to carbon reductions, but in general, if energy production and use are, responsible for about 3/4 of global carbon dioxide emissions. If you want to cut those emissions, you can't ignore energy. So where do you start? Well, you start with efficiency, you start with conservation. Beyond that, you try to electrify everything you possibly can. So you electrify transportation, you electrify buildings, you electrify as much of industry as you can. And that's hard, in the industrial component. But if you're going to do that, then that electricity really has to be clean. So now you're talking about wind and solar, other low carbon energy resources like geothermal, advanced nuclear power, and there are others. But if you're going to do that, now you have a very different grid, especially with wind and solar, and you have to think about how that grid needs to change to enable those resources to play on the grid and keep the grid reliable. So now you're getting into thinking about storage and other related topics. And then beyond that, you have to think about other low carbon fuels, particularly in industry or maybe aviation, long haul transportation. That gets you into thinking about hydrogen, biofuels, fossil fuels with carbon capture. So that's sort of, in a nutshell, where we're headed. A lot of it has to do with electrification as a way of driving down, the carbon emissions from energy use and overall carbon emissions, and then finding ways to make sure that electricity is as clean as possible without sacrificing reliability, without sacrificing affordability, or that sort of thing.
I really appreciate the distinction between what will happen in the future to what will need to happen in the future in order to mitigate the effects of climate change and decarbonize. Nico, same question to you.
I completely agree with everything that was said before. And just to add on to what I think needs to happen and adding on to the electrification as well, and has been mentioned before, is electric energy storage. When I look at electric cars, for example, I'm amazed by how the number has increased. And I did not expect that 5-10 years ago. It's growing crazily fast. And that's interesting to me as a material scientist and engineer as well, because lithium-ion batteries that drive that whole process, that whole increase, have not really changed that much for a while. The basic idea of a lithium-ion battery has been around since the 1990s. Materials have improved. There have been a lot of improvements in capacity and charging them quicker and getting the power out quicker. But the basic idea is still the same has been for a while. So I wonder if there will be a lot of improvements in the next few years, maybe already the next 5 years or 10 years, in switching away from lithium-ion batteries, using different materials instead of the lithium, or replacing the cobalt with other materials. And there's a lot of work happening right now. I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act and the Chips and Science Act, for example, in the US have been really putting a lot of money into this research as well. So I'm looking forward to seeing, hopefully, a lot of improvements in batteries, and maybe quite different batteries in the near future than the lithium-ion batteries now. And the second point I would make, adding to Tom's graph on nuclear energy, I wonder if nuclear energy is going to change again, because it has stagnated for a while, or even decreased a bit in plenty of countries. So I wonder if small modular reactors or advanced small modular reactors will really change the landscape of nuclear energy. Of course, fusion is there as well, but we always are 30 years away from fusion being commercially viable. But I think small reactors could change that as well.
Well, hopefully everybody enjoyed their crash course in the past 10,000 years of energy, and then looking at the next couple hundred of years. At this moment, I want to transition us into breakout rooms.
I have not seen that much progress on battery recycling. That's one of the questions. I know there's more research in that, and there are more companies interested in that. So it's certainly something that's starting up to be really relevant. We don't have enough lithium. We will not have enough lithium in the long term to build all the batteries that we need if we continue with using lithium-ion batteries. So there is a lot of interest in finding ways to recycle that lithium, getting out of an old battery and making a new battery out of it. I have not seen like a great solution to that yet, or a commercially viable solution to that, but there's certainly a lot of work in that. I don't know. I don't have a specific number on that. There is electrical energy storage in form of batteries added to the grid at a very slow pace, I believe. Some, but not a lot. And I think what we really need there is other technologies other than a lithium-ion battery, or at least other materials replacing a lithium to be able to do that.
So I just wanted to close out the session by thanking Tom and Nico and Tim and Casey for such a great session, and to our audience for joining us today.